Chapter 25. The Great Glass Lift. "I've never seen anything like it," cried Mr. Wonka. "The children are disappearing like rabbits. But you mustn't worry about it. They'll all come out in the wash." Mr. Wonka looked at the little group that stood beside him in the corridor. There was only 2 children left now, Mike TV and Charlie Bucket. And there were 3 grown-ups, Mr. and Mrs. TV and Grandpa Joe. "Shall we move on?" Mr. Wonka asked. "Oh yes," cried Charlie and Grandpa Joe, both together. "My feet are getting tired," said Mike TV. "I want to watch television." "If you're tired, then we'd better take the lift," said Mr. Wonka. "It's over here. Come on, off we go." He skipped across the passage to the pair of double doors. The door slid open. The 2 children and the grown-ups went in. "Now then," cried Mr. Wonka, "which button shall we press first? Take your pick." Charlie Bucket stared around him in astonishment. This was the craziest lift he'd ever seen. There were buttons everywhere. The walls and even the ceiling were covered all over with rows and rows of small black push buttons. There must have been 1,000 of them on the wall, and another 1,000 on the ceiling, and now Charlie noticed that every single button had a tiny print label beside it telling you which room it would be taken, which would for press on it. "This isn't just an ordinary up and down lift," announced Mr. Wonka proudly. "This lift can go sideways, long ways, slant ways, and other ways you can think of. It can visit any single room in the whole factory. You simply press the button and zing, you're off." "Fantastic," murmured Grandad Joe. His eyes were shining with excitement as he stared at the rows of buttons. "The whole lift is made of thick, clear glass," Mr. Wonka declared. "The walls, the ceilings, everything is made of glass so that you can see out." "But there's nothing to see," said Mike TV. "Choose a button," said Mr. Wonka. The 2 children may press 1 button each, so take your pick. Hurry up, in every room something delicious and wonderful is being made. Quickly, Charlie started reading for a month. Cavity-filling caramels, no more dentists, stick-jaw for talkative parents, invisible chocolate bars for eating in class, sugar-coated pencils for sucking, fizzy lemonade swimming pools, magic hand fudge. When you hold it in your hand, you taste it in your mouth. Rainbow drops, suck them and you can't spit in 6 different colours. Come on, cried Mr. Wonka. "We can't wait all day." "Isn't there a television room in all of this lot?" asked Mr. TV. "Certainly there's a television room," Mr. Wonka said. "That button over there." He pointed to it with his finger. Everybody looked. "Television chocolate," it said on the tiny label beside the button. "Whoopee!" shouted Mike TV. That's for me." He stuck his thumb and pressed the button. Instantly there was a tremendous whizzing noise. The doors clanged shut and the lift leapt open as though it had been stung by a wasp. But it leapt sideways, and all the passengers, except Mr. Wonka, who was holding on to the strap for the ceiling, were flung to his feet. "Get up!" cried Mr. Wonka, roaring with laughter. But just as they were staggering to their feet, it changed direction. "Help!" shouted Miss TV. "Take my hand, madam," said Mr. Wonka gallantly. "There you are. Now grab this strap. Everybody grab a strap. Your journey's not over." Old Grandpa Joe struggled to his feet and caught a strap. Little Charlie, who couldn't possibly reach as high as that, put his arm around Grandpa Joe's legs and hung on tight. The lift rushed at the speed of a rocket. Now it was beginning to climb. It was shooting up and up and up, and they were climbing as they were climbing a steep hill. Then suddenly, as though it had come to a stop at the hill, gone over, it dropped like a stone, and Charlie felt his tummy coming right up to his throat. Then Grandpa Joe shouted, "Yippee! Here we go!" Mrs. TV cried out, "The rope has broken, we're going to crash." Mr. Wonka said, "Charlie, Charlie shouted, "I love it. It's like being on a roller coaster." And through the glass walls of the lift, he rushed along and caught glimpses of strange and wonderful things on some of the other rooms. An enormous spout with brown sticky stuff oozing out on the floor. A great craggy mountain made entirely of fudge, with Oompa Loompas all roped together for safety, hanging huge hunks of fudge out of the side. A machine with white powder spraying out of like a snowstorm. A lake of hot caramel with steam coming off it. A village of Oompa Loompas with tiny houses and streets and hundreds of Oompa Loompa children, no more than 4 inches high, playing in the streets. And now the lift began flattening out again, but it seemed to be going faster than ever. Charlie could hear the scream of the wind outside as it hailed forward, and it twisted and it turned, and it went up and it went down, and... "I'm going to be sick," yelled Mrs. TV, turning green in the face. "Please don't be sick," said Mr. Wonka. "Try and stop me," said Mrs. TV. "Then you'd better take this." And Mr. Wonka swept his magnificent black hat from his head and held it upside down in front of Miss TV's mouth. "Make this awful thing stop," ordered Miss TV. "Can't do that," said Mr. Wonka. "It won't stop till we get there. I only hope no one's going to use the other lift at the moment." "What other lift?" screamed Mrs. TV. "The one that goes the opposite way on the same time as this track goes." "Holy mackerel!" cried Mr. TV. "You mean we might have a collision?" "I've always been lucky so far," said Mr. Wonka. "Now I am going to be sick," said Mrs. TV. "No, no," said Mr. Wonka. "Not now. We're nearly there. Don't spoil my hat." The next moment there was a screaming of brakes, and the lift began to slow down. Then it stopped altogether. "Some ride," said Mr. TV, wiping his great sweaty face with a handkerchief. "Never again," grasped Mr. TV. And then the door of the lift slid open, and Mr. Wonka said, "Just a minute now. Listen."
Chapter 26. The Television Chocolate Room. The TV family, together with Charlie and Grandpa Joe, stepped out of the lift into a room so dazzlingly bright and dazzlingly white that they screwed up their eyes in pain and stopped walking. Mr. Wonka handed each of them a pair of chocolate of dark glasses and said, "Put these on quick, and don't take them off in here, whatever you do. This light could blind you." As soon as Charlie had his dark glasses on, he was able to look around him in comfort. He saw a long, narrow room. The room was painted white all over. Even the floor was white, and there wasn't a speck of dust anywhere. From the ceiling, huge lamps hung down and bathed the room in a brilliant blue-white light. The room was completely bare except at the far end. At one of these ends there was an enormous camera on wheels, and a whole army of Oompa Loompas was clustering around it, oiling its joints and adjusting its knob and polishing its great glass lens. The Oompa Loompas were all dressed in the most extraordinary way. They were wearing a bright red space suit, complete with helmets and goggles. At least they looked like a space suit, and they were working in complete silence. Watching them, Charlie experienced a queer sense of danger. There was something dangerous about this whole business, and the Oompa Loompa knew it. There was no chatting or singing among them here, and they moved about over the huge black camera slowly and carefully in their scarlet space suit. At the other end of the room, about 50 spaces away from the camera, a single Oompa Loompa, also wearing a spacesuit, was sitting at the black table, gazing at the screen of a very large television set. "Here we go," cried Mr. Wonka, hopping up and down with excitement. "This is the testing room for my very latest and greatest invention, television chocolate." "But what is television chocolate?" asked Mike TV. "Good heavens, child, Stop interrupting me, said Mr. Wonka. It works by television. I don't like television myself. I suppose it's all right in small doses, but children never seem to be able to take it in small doses. They want it to sit there all day long, staring and staring at the screen. That's me, said Mr. Mike TV. Shut up, said Mr. TV. Thank you, said Mr. Wonka. I shall now tell you how this amazing television set of mine works. But first of all, do you know how ordinary television works? It is very simple. At one end, where the picture is being taken, you have a large cine camera and you start photographing something. The photographs are then split up into millions of tiny little pieces which are so small that you cannot see them, and these little pieces are shot out into the sky by electricity. In the sky they go whizzing around all over the place until suddenly they hit the antenna on the roof of somebody's house. They then flashing down the wire that leads right into the back of the television set, and in there they get jiggled and juggled around until at last every single one of these million of tiny pieces fitted back into its right place, just like jigsaw puzzle. And presto, the photograph appears on the screen. That is exactly how it works, Mike TV said. I am a little deaf in my left ear, Mr. Wonka said. You must forgive me if I don't hear everything you say. I said that isn't exactly how it works, shouted Mike TV. You are a nice boy, Mr. Wonka said, but you talk too much. Now then, the very first time I saw ordinary television working, I was struck by a tremendous idea. Look here, I shouted. If these people can break up a photograph into millions of pieces and send the pieces whizzing through the air and then put them together again at the other end, why can't I do the same thing with a bar of chocolate? Why can't I send a real bar of chocolate whizzing through the air in tiny pieces and then put the pieces together at the other end all ready to be eaten? Impossible, said Mike TV. You think so? Cried Mr. Wonka. Well, watch this. I shall now send a bar of my very best chocolate from one end of this room to the other by television. Get ready there. Bring in the chocolate immediately. 6 Umbalumbas marched forward, carrying on their shoulders the most enormous bar of chocolate Charlie had ever seen. It was about the size of the mattress he slept on at home. It has to be big, Mr. Wonka explained, because whenever you send something by television, it always comes out much smaller than it was when it went in. Even with ordinary television, when you photograph a big man, he never comes out on your screen any taller than a pencil, does he? Here we go then. Get ready. No, stop. Hold everything. You there, my TV, stand back. You are too close to the camera. There are dangerous rays coming out of that thing. They could break you up into a million.
Mike TV is sent by television, Chapter 27. Mike TV was even more excited than Grandpa Joe to see a bar of chocolate being sent by television. But Mr. Wonka, he shouted, can you send other things through the air the same way? Breakfast cereals, for instance. Oh, my Saint Aunt, said Mr. Wonka, don't mention that disgusting stuff in front of me. Do you know what breakfast cereal is made of? It's made of all those little curly-whirly shavings you find in pencil sharpeners. But could you send it by television if you wanted to? As you do with the chocolate, said Mike TV. Of course I could. And what about people, said Mike TV. Could you send real-life people from one place to another the same way? A person, cried Mr. Wonka. Are you off your rocker? But could it be done? Good heaven's sake, child, I don't know. Well, I suppose it could. Yes, I'm pretty sure it could. Well, of course it could. I wouldn't like to risk it, though. It might have some nasty results. But Mike TV was already off and running the moment he heard Mr. Wonka saying, I'm pretty sure it could. Of course it could. He turned away and started running as fast as he could towards the end of the room where the great camera was standing. Look at me, he shouted as he ran. I'm the first person in the world to be sent by television. No, 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 cried Mr. Wonka. Mike screamed. Stop, stop, come back. You'll be turned into millions of tiny pieces. But there was no stopping Mike TV now. The crazy boy rushed on, and when he reached the enormous camera, he jumped straight for the switch, scattering Oompa Loompa right, left, everywhere. See you later, alligator, he shouted, and he pulled the switch down, and as he did, he leapt out of the final mighty lens. There was a blinding flash, then there was silence. Then Mrs. TV ran forward, but she stopped dead in the middle of the room, and she stood there, staring at the same place where her son had been, and her great red mouth opened wide and screamed, He's gone! He's gone! Great heavens, he has gone, said Mr. TV. Mr. Wonka hurried forward and placed a hand gently on Mrs. TV's shoulder. We shall have to hope for the best, he said. We must pray that your little boy will come out unharmed at the other end. Mike screamed, Mrs. TV clasping her hands together. Where are you? I'll tell you where he is, said Mr. TV. He's whizzing round above our heads in millions of tiny pieces. Don't talk about it, well, Mr. TV. He must watch the television set, said Mr. Wonka. He may come through any moment. Mr. and Mrs. TV, Grandpa Joe and little Charlie and Mr. Wonka all gathered round the television and stared tensely at the screen. The screen was quite black. He's taken a heck of a long time to come across, said Mr. TV, wiping his brow. Oh dear, said Mr. Wonka. I do hope that no part of him gets left behind. What on earth do you mean? Asked Mr. TV sharply. I don't wish to alarm you, said Mr. Wonka, but it does sometimes happen that only about half of the pieces find their way back to the television set. It was the only half of the bar that came through. Mr. TV let out a scream of horror. You mean only half of Mike is coming back to us, he cried. Let's hope it's the top half, said Mr. TV. Hold everything, said Mr. Wonka. Watch the screen. Something's happening. Then some waves lined and a flicker. Mr. Wonka adjusted one of the knobs and the wavy line went away. And now very slowly the screen began to get brighter and brighter. Here he comes, yelled Mr. Wonka. Yes, that's him, all right. Is he all in one piece? Cried Mr. TV. I'm not sure, said Mr. Wonka. It's too early to tell. Faintly at first, but becoming clearer and clearer, every second the picture of Mike TV appeared on the screen. He was standing up and waving in the audience and grinning from ear to ear. But he's a midget, shouted Mr. TV. Mike cried, Mr. TV, are you all right? Are there any bits of you missing? Isn't he going to get any bigger? Shouted Mr. TV. Talk to me, Mike, cried Mr. TV. Say something. Tell me you're all right. A tiny little voice, no louder than a squeak of a mouse, came up out of the television. Hi, Mum, it said. Hi, Bob, look at me. I'm the first person ever to be sent by television. Grab him, ordered Mr. Wonka, quick. Mrs. TV shot out a hand and picked the tiny figure of Mr. TV out of the screen. Hooray! Cried Mr. Wonka. He's all in one piece. He's completely unharmed. You call that unhand? Snapped Mrs. TV, peering at the little speck of a boy who was now running to and fro across the palm of her hand, waving pistols in the air. He was certainly not more than an inch tall. He shrunk, said Mr. TV. Of course he shrunk, said Mr. Wonka. What did you expect? This is terrible, waved Mr. TV. What are we going to do? And Mrs. TV said, we can't send him back to school like this. He'll get trodden on. He'll get squashed. He won't be able to do anything, cried Mrs. TV. Oh, yes, I will, squeaked the tiny voice of Mike TV. I still be able to watch television. Never again, shouted Mr. TV. I'm throwing the television set right out of the window the moment we get home. I've had enough of television. When he heard this, Mike TV flew into a terrible tantrum. He started jumping up and down the palm of his mother's hand, screaming and yelling and trying to bite her fingers. I want to watch television, he squeaked. I want to watch television. I want to watch television. I want to. Here, give him to me, said Mr. TV, and he took the tiny boy and shoved him into the breast of his coat jacket and stuffed a handkerchief on top. Squeals and yells came from inside the pocket, and the pocket shook as furious little prisoner fought to get out. Oh, Mr. Wonka, wailed Mrs. TV, how can we make him grow? Well, said Mr. Wonka, stroking his beard, gazing thoughtfully in the ceiling, I must say that it's a wee bit tricky, but small boys are extremely springy and elastic. They stretch like mad. So what we'll do, we'll put him in a special machine I have for testing the stretchiness of chewing gum. Maybe that will bring him back to what he was. Oh, thank you, Mrs. TV, said Mrs. TV. Don't mention it, dear lady. How far you'd think he'll stretch, said Mr. TV. Maybe miles, said Mr. Wonka. Who knows? But he's going to be awfully thin. Everything gets thinner when you stretch it. You mean like chewing gum? Asked Mr. TV. Exactly. How thin will he be? Asked Mr. TV anxiously. I haven't the foggiest idea, said Mr. Wonka, and it doesn't really matter anyway, because we'll soon fatten him up again. And we'll have to do it as it give him a triple overdose of my wonderful super vitamin chocolate. Super vitamin chocolate contains huge amounts of vitamin A, vitamin B. It also contains vitamin C, D, vitamins F, vitamin G, vitamins I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, vitamin R, vitamin T, vitamin. But it does contain the very smallest amount of the rarest and most magical vitamin of them all, Vitamin Wonka. What will that do to him? Asked Mr. TV anxiously. It'll make his toes grow out until they are as long as his fingers. Oh no, cried Mrs. TV. Don't be silly, said Mr. Wonka. It's the most useful. He'll be able to play piano with his feet. But Mr. Wonka. No arguments, please, said Mr. Wonka. He turned away and clicked his finger 3 times in the air. An Oompa Loompa appeared immediately and stood beside him. Follow these orders, said Mr. Wonka, holding the Oompa Loompa a piece of paper of which had written full instructions, and you'll find the boy in his father's pocket. Off you go. Goodbye, Mr. TV. Goodbye, Mrs. TV. And please don't look so worried. They'll come out in the wash, you know, every one of them. At the end of the room, the Oompa Loompas around the giant camera were already beating their tiny drums and beginning to jog up and down onto the rhythm. There they go again, said Mr. Wonka. I'm afraid you can't stop them singing. Little Charlie caught Grandpa Joe's hand, and 2 of them stood beside Mr. Wonka in the middle of the light bright room, listening to Oompa Loompas, and this is what they sang. It rots the senses in the head, it kills imagination dead. It clogs and clutters up the mind, it makes a child so dull and blind. He can no longer understand a fantasy, a fairy land. His brain becomes as soft as cheese, his powers of thinking rust and freeze. He cannot think, he only sees. All right, you cry, all right, you say, but if we take the set away, what shall we do to entertain our darling children? Please explain. We'll answer this by asking you, what used the darlings used to do? How used they keep themselves contented before this monster was invented? Have you forgotten, don't you know? Why, say it very loud and slow. They used to read. They'd read and read and read and read, and then they'd proceed to read some more. Great Scott, gadzooks! One half of their lives was reading books. The nursery shelves had held books galore, books cluttered up the nursery floor, and in the bedroom by the bed more books were waiting to be read. Such wondrous fine, fantastic tales of dragons, gypsies, queens and whales, and treasures, isles and distant shores, where smugglers rode their muffled oars, and pirates wearing purple pants, and sailing ships and elephants, and cannibals crouching round the pot, staring away as something hot. It smells so good, what can it be? Good gracious, it's Penelope. The younger ones had Beatrix Potter, with Mr. Todd, the dirty rotter, and Squirrel Nutkin, Piglet Bland, and Mrs. Tigglewinkle, and just how the camel got his hump, and how the monkey lost his rump, and Mr. Todd, and bless my soul, there's Mr. Rat and Mr. Mole. Oh, books, what books they used to know, those children living long ago. So please, oh please, we beg, we pray, go throw your TV set away, and on its place you can install a lovely bookshelf on the wall. Then fill the shelves with lots of books, or ignore all the dirty books, the screams, the yells, the bites, the kicks, the children hitting you with sticks. Fear not, because we promise you that in about a week or two of having nothing else to do, they'll now begin to feel the need of having something good to read. And once they start, oh boy, you watch the slowly growing joy that fills their hearts. They'll grow so keen, they'll wonder what they've ever seen in that ridiculous machine, that nauseating, foul, unclean, repulsive television screen. And later each and every kid will love you more for what you did. P.S. Regarding my TV, we very much regret that we shall simply have to wait and see if we can get him back his height, but if we can't, it serves him right.
Chapter 28. Only Charlie Left. Which room shall it be next? Said Mr. Wonka as he turned away and darted into the lift. Come on, hurry up, we must get going. And how many children are there left now? Little Charlie looked at Grandpa Joe, and Grandpa Joe looked back at little Charlie. But, Mr. Wonka, Grandpa Joe called after him, there's only Charlie left now. Mr. Wonka swung round and stared at Charlie. There was a silence. Charlie stood there holding tightly onto Grandpa Joe's hand. You mean you're the only one left? Said Mr. Wonka, pretending to be surprised. Why, yes, whispered Charlie, yes. Mr. Wonka suddenly exploded with excitement. "But my dear boy," he cried out, "that means you've won." He rushed out of the lift and started shaking Charlie's hand so furiously it nearly came off. "Oh, I do congratulate you," he cried. "I really do. I'm absolutely delighted. It couldn't be better. How wonderful this is. I had a hunch, right from the beginning that it was going to be you. Well done, Charlie, well done. This is terrific. Now the fun is really going to start. But we mustn't dilly, we mustn't dally. There's even less time to lose now than there was before. We have an enormous number of things to do before the day is out. Just think of the arrangements that have to be made and the people we have to fetch. But luckily for us, we have the great glass lift to speed things up. Jump in, my dear Charlie, jump in. You too, Grandpa Joe, sir. No, after you, that's the way. Now then, this time I shall choose the button we are going to press. Mr. Wonka's bright twinkling blue eyes rested for a moment on Charlie's face. Something crazy is going to happen now, Charlie thought, but he wasn't frightened. He wasn't even nervous. He was just terrifically excited, and so was Grandpa Joe. The old man's face was shining with excitement as he watched every move that Mr. Wonka made. Mr. Wonka was reaching for a button high up on the glass ceiling of the lift. Charlie and Grandpa Joe both craned their necks to read what it said on the little label beside the button. It said, "Up and out." "Up and out?" thought Charlie. "What sort of a room is that?" Mr. Wonka pressed the button. The glass doors closed. "Hold on," cried Mr. Wonka. Then, wham! The lift shot straight up like a rocket. "Yippee!" shouted Grandad Joe. Charlie was clinging to Grandpa Joe's legs, and Mr. Wonka was holding on to a strap from the ceiling. And up they went, up, straight up this time, with no twistings or turnings. And Charlie could hear the whistling of the air outside as the lift went faster and faster. "Yippee!" shouted Grandpa Joe again. "Yippee! Here we go!" "Faster!" cried Mr. Wonka, banging on the wall of the lift with his hand. "Faster, faster! If we don't go any faster than this, we shall never get through." "Through what?" shouted Grandpa Joe. "What have we got to get through?" "Aha!" cried Mr. Wonka. "You wait and see. I've been longing to press this button for years, but I've never done it until now. I was tempted many times. Oh yes, I was tempted, but I couldn't bear the thought of making a great big hole in the roof of the factory. Here we go, boys, up and out." "But you don't mean," shouted Grandpa Joe, "you don't really mean that this lift—" "Oh yes, I do," answered Mr. Wonka. "You wait and see. Up and out." But, it's made of glass," shouted Grandpa Joe. "It'll break into a million pieces." "I suppose it might," said Mr. Wonka, cheerful as ever, "but it's pretty thick glass, all the same." The lift rushed on, going up and up and up, faster and faster and faster. Then suddenly, crash! And the most tremendous noise of splintering wood and broken tiles came from directly above their heads. And Grandpa Joe shouted, "Help! It's the end! We're done for!" And Mr. Wonka said, "No, we're not. We're through. We're out." Sure enough, the lift had shot right up through the roof of the factory and was now rising into the sky like a rocket, and the sunshine was pouring in through the glass roof. In 5 seconds they were 1,000 feet up in the sky. "The lift's gone mad!" shouted Grandpa Joe. "Have no fear, my dear sir," said Mr. Wonka calmly, and he pressed another button. The lift stopped. It stopped and hung in mid-air, hovering like a helicopter hovering over the factory and over the very town itself, which lay spread out below them like a picture postcard. Looking down through the glass floor on which he was standing, Charlie could see the small faraway houses and the streets and the snow that lay thickly over everything. It was an eerie and frightening feeling to be standing on clear glass high up in the sky. It made you feel that you weren't standing on anything at all. "Are we all right?" cried Grandpa Joe. "How does this thing stay up?" "Sugar power," said Mr. Wonka. 1,000,000 sugar power. Oh, look," he cried, pointing down. "There go the other children. They're returning home."
Chapter 29. The Other Children Go Home. "We must go down and take a look at our little friends before we do anything else," said Mr. Wonka. He pressed a different button and he lifted drop lower, and soon it was hovering just above the entrance gate to the factory. "Look down now, Charlie. Could you see the children and their parents standing in a little group just inside the gate?" "I can only see 3, he said. "Who's missing?" "I expect it's Mike," Mr. Wonka said, "but he will be coming along soon." "Do you see the trucks?" Mr. Wonka pointed to a line of gigantic covered vans parked in a line nearby. Yes, Charlie said. What are they for? Don't you remember what it said on the golden tickets? Every child goes home with a lifetime supply of sweets. There is one truckload for each of them. Load to the brim. Mr. Wonka went on. There goes our friend Augustus Gloop. Do you see him? He's getting into the first truck with his mother and father. You mean he's really all right? Asked Charlie Aston. You mean he's really all right? Asked Charlie, astonished, even after going up that awful bike. He's very much all right, said Mr. Wonka. He's changed, said Grandpa Joe, peering down through the glass wall of the elevator. He used to be fat. Now he is thin as a straw. Of course he's changed, said Mr. Wonka, laughing. He got squeezed in the pipe, don't you remember? And look, there goes Miss Violet, the great gum chewer. It seems as though they managed to deduce her after all. I'm so glad, and how healthy she looks, much better than before. But she's Babel in the fact, cried Grandpa Joe. She is, said Mr. Wonka. Well, there's nothing we can do about that. Good gracious, cried Charlie. Look at both Fergus Salt and Mr. Salt and Mrs. Salt. They are simply covered with rubbish. And here comes Mike, said Mike TV, said Grandpa Joe. Good heavens, what have they done to him? He's about 10 feet tall and thin as a wire. They have overstretched him on the gum stretching machine, said Mr. Wonka. How very careless. But how dreadful for him, cried Charlie. Nonsense, said Mr. Wonka. He is very lucky. Every basketball team in the country will be trying to get him. But now, he added, it is time we left these for silly children. I have something very important to talk to you about. My dear Charlie, Mr. Wonka pressed another button and the lift swung upwards into the sky.
Chapter 30, Charlie's Chocolate Factory. The great glass lift was now hovering high over the town. Inside the lift stood Mr. Wonka, Grandpa Joe and little Charlie. How I love my chocolate factory, said Mr. Wonka, gazing down. Then he paused and he turned around and looked at Charlie with the most serious expression on his face. Do you love it too, Charlie? He asked. Oh yes, cried Charlie. I think it's the most wonderful place in the whole world. I am very pleased to hear you say that, said Mr. Wonka, looking more serious than ever. He went on, staring at Charlie. Yes, he said, I am very pleased indeed to hear you say that. And now I shall tell you why. Mr. Wonka cocked his head to one side, and all at once the tiny twinkling wrinkles of a smile appeared around the corners of his eyes, and he said, You see, my dear boy, I have decided to make you a present of the whole place. As soon as you are old enough to run it, the entire factory will become yours. Charlie stared at Mr. Wonka. Grandpa Joe opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. It's quite true, Mr. Wonka said, smiling broadly. I am giving it to you. That's all right, isn't it? Giving it to him, gasped Grandpa Joe. You must be joking. I'm not joking, sir. I'm deadly serious. But why should you want to give your factory to little Charlie? Listen, Mr. Wonka said, I'm an old man. I'm much older than you think. I can't go on forever. I've got no children of my own, no family at all. So who is going to run the factory when I get too old to do it myself? Someone's got to keep it going, if only for the sake of the Oompa Loompas. Mind you, there are thousands of clever men who could give anything for the chance to come in and take over from me. But I don't want that sort of person. I don't want a grown-up person at all. A grown-up won't listen to me, he won't learn. He will try to do things his own way and not mine. So I have to have a child. I want a good, sensible, loving child, one to whom I can tell all my most precious sweet-making secrets while I am still alive. So that is why you sent out the golden tickets, cried Charlie. Exactly, said Mr. Wonka. I decided to invite 5 children to the factory, and the one I liked best at the end of the day would be the winner. But, Mr. Mr. Wonka, stammered Grandpa Joe, do you really and truly mean you are giving the whole of this enormous factory to little Charlie? After all... There's no time for arguments, cried Mr. Wonka. We must go at once and fetch the rest of the family. Charlie's father and his mother and anyone else that's around. They can all live in the factory from now on. They can all help to run it until Charlie is old enough to do it by himself. Where do you live, Charlie? Charlie peered down through the glass floor at the snow-covered houses that lay below. It's over there, he pointed. It's that little cottage right on the edge of town, the tiny little one. I see it, cried Mr. Wonka, and he pressed some more buttons and the lift shot down towards Charlie's house. I'm afraid my mother won't come with us, Charlie said sadly. Why ever not? Because she won't leave Grandma Josephine and Grandma Georgina and Grandpa George. But they must come too. They can't, Charlie said. They're very old and they haven't been out of bed for 20 years. Well, then we'll take the bed along as well with them in it, said Mr. Wonka. There's plenty of room in this lift for a bed. You couldn't get the bed out of the house, said Grandpa Joe. It won't go through the door. You mustn't despair, cried Mr. Wonka. Nothing is impossible, you watch. The lift was hovering over the roof of the Bucket's little house. What are you going to do? Cried Charlie. I'm going right on in to fetch them, said Mr. Wonka. How? Asked Grandpa Joe. Through the roof, said Mr. Wonka, pressing another button. No, shouted Charlie. Stop, shouted Grandpa Joe. Crash went the lift right down through the roof of the house into the old people's bedroom. Showers of dust and broken tiles and bits of wood and cockroaches and spiders and bricks and cement went raining down on the three old ones who were lying in bed. Each of them thought the end of the world had come. Grandma Georgina fainted, Grandma Josephine dropped her false teeth, Grandpa George put his head under the blanket, and Mr. and Mrs. Bucket came rushing in from the next room. Save us, cried Grandma Josephine. Calm yourself, my darling wife, said Grandpa Joe, stepping out of the lift. It's only us. Mother, cried Charlie, rushing into Mrs. Bucket's arms. Mother, listen to what's happened. We're all going to back to live in Mr. Wonka's factory and we're going to help him to run it. And he's given it all to me and... What are you talking about? Said Mrs. Bucket. Just look at our house, cried Mr. Bucket. It's in ruins. My dear sir, said Mr. Wonka, jumping forward and shaking Mustard Bucket warmly by the hand. I'm so very glad to meet you. You mustn't worry about your house. From now on, you're never going to need it again anyway. Who is this crazy man? Screamed Grandpa Josephine. He could have killed us all. This, said Grandpa Joe, is Mr. Willy Wonka himself. It took quite a time for Grandpa Joe and Charlie to explain to everyone exactly what had been happening to them all day, and even then they all refused to ride back to the factory in the lift. I'd rather die in my bed, shouted Grandma Josephine. So would I, said Grandma Georgina. I refuse to go, announced Grandpa George. So, Mr. Wonka and Grandpa Joe and Charlie, taking no notice of their screams, and simply pushed the bed into the lift. They pushed Mr. and Mrs. Bucket in after it, then they got in themselves. Mr. Wonka pressed the button, the doors closed, Grandma Georgina screamed, and the lift rose up off the floor and shot through the hole in the roof out into the open sky. Charlie climbed onto the bed and tried to calm the three old people who were still petrified with fear. Please don't be frightened, he said. It's quite safe and we're going to the most wonderful place in the world. Charlie's right, said Grandpa Joe. Will there be anything to eat when we get there? Said Grandma Josephine. I'm starving. The whole family is starving. Anything to eat? Cried Charlie, laughing. Oh, you just wait and see. And that's the end of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Hope you enjoyed it.